Hey guys, welcome to Video Copilot. Just kidding. This is not Video Copilot. Welcome to Polygon Division. Today we're going to be recreating this effect. It can be found under Video Copilot's stock footage effects section called Shockwave. This is the effect we're going to be rendering out and creating today. It's relatively easy. Anyone that follows along in this video tutorial and just clicks along will be able to recreate this and add their own personal touches and flares. We're going to be using the Redshift render, and the Redshift render has a little bit of a shortcoming in terms of how it renders particles. You cannot use the add blending mode to particles as of yet inside of Redshift. So if you use Octane Render, you might be able to use Octane Render to render out the particles and get better results. So that's something to keep in mind. So what we're going to be recreating is this effect right here. So if I click this, if you look at this effect, it looks like an ink blotch or like a kind of a energy force field kind of an effect. It bursts out. And what I'm talking about is you can see there's white highlights. We're going to have to recreate this inside of After Effects because these highlights do not come out inside of the render by default. So Insidium X Particles allows you to render these out with these highlights because there is a blend mode. We'll take a look at that in a second. Let's go into Cinema 4D and take a look. So here's one of those effects that's cached, and it looks kind of funny. The particles look big because it is cached. It basically does the draw size larger. You see I can't adjust it once you cache it. It looks better before you cache it. So just keep that in mind. Once you cache it, it locks in the render and the particles are slightly bigger. So we'll see that working in a little bit. But here it is rendered out. And you notice when I render out, the areas that are the particles are stacked up the most, which are these parts right here, they're not adding the highlights. So we're going to recreate that inside of After Effects. So here's the end result. And I'll put up on the screen the actual final result right here. So check that out. Okay, so here we are in a blank scene. And what I've done is I've gone into the render settings and set it to 2000 by 2000 because we're going to want a square document. And we'll set it to all frames. And that's all I've done for the render settings as of now. We'll go in and adjust them better in a second. And what we want to do is we want to start off with the thing that is going to collide to create that diffusion effect. So what we'll do is we're going to go in here to a cone. I initially started out with a cube and squished it, and that worked all right, but you get a better result with the cone. So I'm going to set the cone to the bottom radius of 500 because I want this to be 1,000 units across. The height I'm going to set to 100. And what's going to happen is the particles are going to get dispersed onto this cone and spread outward so we get a nice hollow center. And then for the radius rotations, I'm going to set it to something like 40. We don't want too many rotations, but just enough to get the collider to not show this geometric shape. And then we'll set these to something like 20. So there's our collider. I'm going to right click on it, go to simulation tags, and I'm going to add the collider object. I'm going to turn down the collisions and bounces and everything. I'm going to leave it on triangle mesh. And what it's going to do is it's going to draw a triangle and remesh this. So you don't want too much. Call this floor. And there we go. Next, what we do is we need an emitter. So I've already got a setup here with all of these dragged out and into a palette. I'm going to just do a basic emitter, and the emitter I'm going to drag up, and then we'll come in here and type in -90, and that's going to face it downwards. And for this shape, we want a circle, and I'm going to set this to something like 50, tab 50, so we get a smaller emission. And what we want to do is we want to emit these a lot faster to get that initial boof. So we'll do a shot of 1,000 particles, and we'll go to the properties and change the color to white. This is just a visual guide, and the radius we'll just leave it 1, and the speed we'll set to something like 600. And let's check this out. So they go pretty fast. Now what we want to do is we want to go and open up the lifetime and set this to something like 3 and 3. So we get them very short, something like that. There we go. And you can adjust these as you see fit. But as of right now, this is going 200 centimeters downward. One thing I forgot to mention is the floor. I want to be on 0. So we're 100 units. So we'll take this and go -50, which is half. And now there we go. So what I want these particles to do is expire about halfway. And then that means that the volume that's going to get pushed downwards continues from there and then disperses. So we'll rename this to volume emitter and volume volume group. So volume emitter and volume group. And that's all we need for this section. Now what we're going to do is we're going to right click on the volume group, not the emitter, but the volume group. We're going to right click, go to simulation tags, and we're going to click on Pyro emitter. And I always do the emitter by accident, but it gets put on the group. And then if we hit play, you can see there's our smoke, but it goes upwards. We want it to go downwards. So this is an easy fix. So what we do is we're going to select the pyro output, go to the pyro scene, and we're going to open up the scene default simulation scene. And we're going to go to pyro, and the buoyancy, we're going to just do 10. And you can adjust these later. And we're going to do, I'm going to do negative number here, 0.2. And what this does is it's going to force the temperature down like really fast. And then the buoyancy takes over after the temperature cools off. And so once the temperature cools off, it's going to cool and move downwards by using the buoyancy. So let's see. And what you're going to do is if your volume spreads too far downwards, or it doesn't go enough, you're going to adjust this buoyancy value. So if you want it to come down further down the cone, bring it up to like 12. And so watch, you're going to see it go down further. So it ended right here and it kind of travels a little bit further. And it's going to be more obvious once we change the time that this fades out. So let's go ahead and do that. So what we'll do is on the temperature, we'll bring this down to something like 4 so that it pushes it harder down and dissipates slower on the temperature. And also on the density, we'll bring that down to 4 as well. And you don't want to put it down to 1 because they'll never fade out. And so you can see there's more density, and that's enough for our trail. And then let's set up the camera. So what we'll do is we'll click the camera, and I'm going to set this to 14, and I'll explain why I'm setting it to 14. I'm going to look through the camera, place it underneath like so, and then I'm going to zero this out, put this to 90 degrees, zero this out. This is going to be our distance from the object, and then zero this out. So then what we're going to do is we're going to move in and out like this to frame it up. So we'll turn off the floor object, and you can see, there we go. And the reason I have this at such a wide angle camera lens is because it exaggerates the depth of the smoke. And also right when it starts, this little ball is a lot smaller. So you can even increase it to like 10 or 9 or 8. You can play around with that. So what I'll do is I'm going to lock the camera. So I'll right click. I actually have a lock right here, but you just right click and you go to rigging tags, and then you'll see protection. So I'll protect it, and then I'm going to uncheck the Y so that I can move it up and down to get it correct. There we go. So here it moves, and you'll notice the smoke does not move that fast. And that's because on our volume, there's a little volume emitter here. What you want to do is you want to go to this velocity and set the set to movement to something like 600. And what this is going to do is it's going to incorporate the speed of the particles that are emitted more into the volume. So you can see there's more speed now to the smoke based off of the particle speed. And so there you go. That's essentially it. So let's set up the advection. This is not rendering out the actual volume fire effect in the smoke. This is actually particles that follow along the surface of the internals of that volume. And that's how you're able to get this. And one of our clues was this shot here. This is actually a render of the volume that's used to create these. So these are particles that are emitted at the same time that kind of swirl inside of the smoke. And so when you see some of these other examples, these are just different renders stacked and put on top of each other with different color effects. So let's get some particles inside, and then we're going to adjust the vortices and everything like that in a second. So let's go out of the camera, and what we'll do is we'll come in here and we're going to add another emitter. So I'll come in here and say basic emitter. Same thing, go here and type in -90, bring this up, and I'm going to place it just below the first emitter where the smoke is being emitted. And what we'll do is we'll set the speed to something like 500. The lifetime we'll just leave to its default. Go to the emission here, and I'll set this to something like 60. So slightly bigger, and we'll set it to circle. And what we're going to do is we're going to do a shot at first and just put this to like 10,000. And to get these particles to follow along, let's turn off the original particles, and this particle is going to follow along on this smoke. And to do that, you're going to select the particle group. And in the simulation section under modifiers, you'll see there's one called Pyro Advect. I've got it right here. And so I'm just going to click it while holding shift, and that adds it in. And the Pyro Advection just means that the particles will follow the smoke. And so what we're going to do is instead of leaving it at 1, I'm going to set this to 0.95. So it's not 100% fast. And I'll show you why in a second. So I'll go back, and you can see, there you go. So you can see the particles start too soon. So I'm just going to move 1 or 2 frames forward and say, I want to emit them right where this is coming down a little bit. So I'll go to my emitter. I'm on frame 3. So I'll go to the emission tab and say start frame. We'll put 3. And let's see if this works. And you can see they get caught in the mess. And so there's your advection happening. So we can go in here to the camera view. Now I want to see it without the smoke. So what I'll do is I'll come into the Pyro. You're going to scroll all the way down to the bottom of the Pyro scene here, and you'll see draw. You're going to uncheck that. I'm going to turn off bounding box too. We don't need to see that. And there's our particles getting launched. And you can see some of them, let me go a couple frames forward. You can see we've got stray particles just flying out. They don't know where to go and get captured. So what we'll do to fix that, that has to do with the emission. So what we'll do is we'll go here to the particles section and we'll bring up the substeps of the particles to something like 5, and let's see if that fixes it. And there you go. So it just had to do with substeps. So if your particles go flying, just increase the substeps. You don't want to go too crazy with that. There, that fixes it. So next what we can do is we can come in here to our emitter and we can start increasing this. So now we're going to do 100,000, and this value is going to get huge, just so you know. So what I'll do is I'm just going to let this play out, and we'll go to 120. And so you see they kind of explode towards the end. That's because the particles didn't die off before the volume dissipated. The volume has kind of dissipated and kind of explodes outwards. So the volume is no longer carrying the advection particles. So we want it to fade off about 75 frames. So what we'll do is we'll come into the emitter, go to the properties. Instead of saying lifetime, we'll do 75 with a variance of 30 frames. So 1 second, hit back, and you'll see they'll fade out right before they get lost. And if the volume disappears, what you can do is you can come in here to the Pyro, go to the density and just bring it down 1 step to 3%, and the temperature down to 3 as well. And that will help capture and keep the smoke up longer. Now let's talk about adjusting this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add some more particles here, and you want to go kind of mellow with this at first while you're getting the look down. So I've got 300,000 particles, and that should give us a look to see the detail. And you'll notice it looks good until it gets to about here, and then we kind of lose those banding and the striations that we're seeing. It just gets too noisy. So to fix that, what we'll do is in the volume here, we'll go to the pyrocene particle pyro section. I found leaving the voxel size is good at 5. When you go down to 3, I'll put it down to 3 and I'll show you what you get. Not only is it slower, you'll lose some particles, so they fly off. It's just too much detail, and it's not really necessary. It just adds unnecessary detail. So I'm going to leave it at 5. And what you do is under extra forces, I'm going to close these up so it's easier to look at. So the particles are escaping too fast off to the side. So I'm actually going to bring this back down to 10, and you'll see the particles don't fall down as quickly. So we're able to keep this kind of closer. And so if I put it to 8, you'll see they don't travel nearly as far. So 8 looks like a good number. So let's fix this noisiness that's happening. So the way you fix it is the culprit is this vortice strength. So I've been actually turning this down to like 0.5, and that seems to do the trick. But then what we're losing is we're losing those nice striations, and that's from the turbulence. I found the vortice kind of affects the later. So if you want it to start off, you could actually keyframe it. So let's actually do that. So we'll put it to 7, put it at frame 0, and go to something like 40 and bring it down to 0. So the vortice is introduced so we don't get a blob at the beginning, but then we fade it out because towards the end of the volume life, it starts getting noisy. Next, what we can do is I'm going to explain the turbulence. So turbulence is just noise, 3D noise that's added to it, and your frequency is how fast that's evolving, and your octave is how detailed it is. I've been turning this down to 3 on the octaves, and then under the size, somewhere around 500 is good. And then the incremental octave strength, I've been turning down because what this does is it says this is the incremental detail. So you've got 2 noises. You've got your initial, and then it adds more noise over the life at this speed, which is set to 0.8, which is too fast, because what it's doing is it's adding a bunch of noise at the end. So if we reduce this down to 100, and then what you do is you can adjust this value If you want bigger curls, you put bigger numbers. Smaller, tighter curls, you put smaller numbers. Anywhere between 800 and 200 for this value is a good value to put. So let's play it. So there we go. I'm going to bring this back to 10 so it travels a little bit more. And then we want more turbulence happening. So I'm going to bring this up to 200. And you don't want to go super crazy with it because you'll really see it towards the end. The other thing I've been undoing is this scale with velocity. Turn that off. So we still get those curls at the very beginning, which is great. And there we go. We get this nice striations happening here. And if this is evolving too fast, you can take the frequency and just bring it down to 0.5 and it'll move slower. So I'm going to hit back just to make sure it reset. There we go. So you can play around with this value. If you go to 300, it becomes a little bit too much distortion. Maybe that's a look. You can render them without, you kind of see it breaks it up a lot towards the end. I'll put it at 150 for now. And just play with these values and just kind of stick in this realm. And then what you're going to do is you're going to render out one of these and then just click this next seed and you'll get a different one that you can overlay over the top of it and it changes it. The other thing we can do is there's another turbulence in the emission. So if we select the volume group and the tag for the emitter here, you'll see there's one called noise and this is on. And what this does is this adds noise to the initial particles that are getting emitted. So we can bring this down to like 100 and increase the octave so we get more detail in that initial turbulence. So you could see it kind of came out with more knurled, which looks cool and just adds more randomness to the initial event. So this is on the volume emitter turbulence. So what you can do is you can render out another one and then just click the next seed and get a completely different look, different curls and everything to overlay. Now, if you're getting particles that you don't want to be in the middle, I'm going to show you how to fix that in a second, but let's set up our particles to get rendered out. Backtrack a step here and talk about X particles. So X particles has the ability in the color tab, you'll see it says blend. You can set this to add. This does not exist inside of Redshift, but I think it does have it inside of Octane Render. So this part you might be able to skip over and get better results than what I'm getting, but we'll fix it in post anyway. So it's not a huge deal, but basically what this does is the transparency of the particle will get alpha blended over the top of other particles, and where they stack up, you'll be able to add the brightness, and that's where we get this really bright. This one's better to look at. See how it's brighter where it's the most dense? You don't really get that effect without doing the add, which we don't have the ability to do inside the default Redshift render. So I'm going to just delete that. And what we're going to do is on the particle group, we're going to right click. So I'm going to call this Advect particle group and Advect emitter. So to this group, we're going to right click on it, go to render tags, and it's off screen, but you can see you're going to right click, go to render tags, and you'll see there's a Redshift object. We're applying it to the Advect particle group. And what we're going to do is we're going to change this to point instances. And then this is where we're going to change down here at the bottom, the render scale size. And that's going to come in handy for how many particles. So you're going to be balancing how many particles that your computer can handle and the size. So if you have like a crazy machine I have a dual card system, but where I lack is memory. I have 64 gigs. And with these particles, they get massive. And so you might run into memory issues. So we're kind of limited. So if we can do a ton of particles, you'll be able to take the scale modifier and bring that down. Now, if you don't have a very fast computer, don't worry. I'm going to show you some tricks in the render and caching and stuff like that to make it so you can get some quick render times and still get really good results. So we set this to point instances, and that's all we're going to change. That's into the particle tab. Next, what we'll do is we'll build out the particle. So we're going to double click. And by the way, I'm in the Redshift section. I have it set default to Redshift. And if you click this plus button, you'll see there's one called particle. We're not going to use this because it's the old particle renderer. We're going to use the standard. So if you click here and you just go to standard for this. So I'm going to drag it onto the particle group and let's optimize this. So what we're going to do is we're going to turn off the base color and reflections. We don't want these two. We're not using transmission. We're not using anything except for emission. We're going to set to 1. And then what we're going to do is, because we want these particles to blend with each other to appear as a solid mass, we're going to go to the opacity and we're going to bring this down. And we're going to start off with it set to 50%. So the alpha, when there's two particles over the top of each other, it's going to add up to 100%. And as we add more particles, you'll be able to reduce this amount. And we're going to get it down to about 10%, but for now we'll leave it at 50% roughly. And let's play this out a couple frames, something like that. I'm going to go to my render view and hit play. And there we go. So you can see we're getting that kind of vorticey effect happening. The particles are rather large. So what we can do is we can take our particle and bring it down to 0.5. And now we're getting something we like. I'm also going to take the particle and I'm going to now drop it down to 20%. So that means it takes 5 particles to be solid white. So you can see right here where there's 5 particles in the volume stacked up, making a complete white. And it's not showing white because I've got the color management set to aces. It's not going to do complete white, just so you know. So if it looks gray, that's because you have aces on. Okay, so here it is. So you can see we've got these nice wisps and tendrils happening. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a bunch more here, and we'll go to the Advecting emitter, and let me turn off the render here. I can hear it going. My GPUs are firing up. So we're at 300,000. I'm going to bring this to 1 million. So it's kind of hard to see. So I'm going to just type 1 and then 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. So that's 1 million. We'll hit play. And I kind of want to get these to look similar to the render. So what I'll do is I'll go to the color tab, set this to white, and also set the radius to 0.5, and also in the Advect group, actually we're going to leave this at 1 just in case, but we're going to change the particle group in the viewport where it says draw, set this to 0.5, and this will get us as close to the render as possible. We can also go to the filter here, turn off work plane, turn off all this stuff here. You can also turn off the particle emitter so we're not seeing it. There we go. So now this is just you playing around with the tendril settings in the Pyro output, going to Pyro Scene Pyro and adjusting these parameters. So if I want something different, I just change this number, that's it. And it'll look the same, but slightly different. So you can see now we have a wisp up here. So it's the same thing, same shape, same velocity, same everything, but with a different turbulence, and it just gives it a little bit of a different look. We can also go here if we want a different look, go to the noise and just increase this value one more in the seed. And now it's in another different shape. So you can see we still have that wisp coming up to the top. So I can come in here, change the seed, and you'll see that wisp changes. So same thing, different wisps. Okay, so next what we're gonna do is this is looking really good. So I'm ready to start rendering this out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the emission and I'm going to jack this up. I was able to do 20 million with my machine. So what we're going to do is we're going to just add a 1 to this. So we're going to do 10 million, and I'm not going to play this. I'm just going to cache it. So what you do to cache this is you select your particle group, and this is really important. You go to cache, and we're going to just say cache object, and it's going to bring you up this Finder window. And I've created in my Cinema 4D folder a cache folder, and you're going to save it here. Don't let it do a default folder. You want to know where this is because you can see I did one of these. They'll get up to 30 gigabytes. So they'll become very massive. So make sure you have a computer space for it. I'm going to call this Shockwave, do its thing. So it's going to play through this, and I'm going to hit cancel because one thing I forgot to set, it's going to go kind of slow if I don't. Go to the Pyro output, go to object, and you're going to turn off all of these. That's going to make it go quicker because we're not rendering any of these out. It makes no difference. And I'm going to restart my scene here. So I'm going to save it. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to select my Pyro output. You want to turn off all of these settings here. That's going to make your advection quicker. So I'll do cache object, and that should go quicker. Now, this will probably take about 5 minutes, depending on how many particles you have in your scene. Because I'm recording, I'm going to keep the volume particle amount pretty low, but for you, because you're not recording and doing this in real time, you'll be able to get that particle advection amount a lot higher than what I'm capable of doing. I was able to get up to 20 million just to give you a good idea of your headroom, and it's above 10 million where things start blending together more. So you want as many particles as you can get and that your hard drive space will allow. So with magic editing, I will speed up this process and come back once it's done. Okay, so it just finished. Before you play back anything or play the button or do anything, what you're going to do is you're going to check all of these. Let's adjust this here. Let's move the camera down. And what we're going to do is we're going to just click and drag down and disable all of them, and then come back to the particle advection group and just turn that on. So we're not emitting any particles because all we want to do is we want to see the cache object that this is playing here. So I should be able to jump to 75 frames, and there we go. So you can see the particles are a lot larger. I have no idea why that changes the display of them. I hope they fix this, but it's cached them in this location, and we can click the folder and you can see in here, there's the particle advection group right here. And you can see the size is 40 gigabytes. So it's massive. So there we go. So it's ready to render, so I should be able to drag the playhead at any point, and you can see it plays back. And with 10 million particles, it's going to be a little bit jumpy. I'm also recording, so you're going to probably get better playback. Recording does a lot of limitations, unfortunately. And what we'll do is we'll just move it into this middle section, go to our render view, which I've docked in the viewport, hit play. And if you've got this set up with the default render settings, it's going to be kind of slow at first. So what we'll do is, yeah, see, we're running out of memory space. So what we'll do is I have to restart. But basically what we're going to do is we're going to come in here to the render settings, and let's go to our Redshift tab, which I've also docked in the viewport. And let's set this up properly. So we're going to go to caustics, make sure that's unchecked, AOV's disabled. We're going to turn up, I was able to render out buckets of 512, which was good. And there's a render settings video that I go through, which discuss that. So go ahead and check that out. I'll link it up at the top of the video here. And what we'll do is we're going to turn this off, turn this off, turn this off, turn this off. And now here's where our particles come into play. So I'm going to bring this up to 40, meaning 40 particles can stack on top of each other to build the transparency to get to 100%. That is an estimate. I think 40 is good enough for what we're doing. We're going to turn off global illumination. We don't need that because we're lighting our scene with the luminance channel right here, and we don't need particle illumination. So it's self-illuminating. Motion blur is turned off. And then we can take the sample threshold and just bring that to like 0.5, which is really high. And I brought the filter size down to 2 so they're not too blurry. It's set to 2.5 normally. And I'm going to turn off denoising. And that was the render settings that I did. And if you get this memory issue, I already rebuilt this before. I was showing you the demo before. So it's probably not going to render. I'll need to restart. So let me restart and come back. So I'll be right back. Okay, so I restarted my machine, cleared out the video memory. Everything's good. And here's the example rendered out. And what we're going to do is we're going to set it to bucket to get a better view because it's going to be a little bit blurry. So let's try this. And there it goes. It works. So you can see my render time's under 6 seconds, which is great. So these can render out really quickly with these render settings set to what they are. So if I go to Redshift, I brought the threshold way up to 0.5. You could probably even go to 1. Globals, I brought all these down to 0 and increased the transparency amount to 40. Global illumination was turned off. Caustics is turned off. AOVs is disabled. And if I was to render this out from experience, because there's transparency and the background is transparent, what I found, you get a box when you render. Some of these particles will have a box through them of different brightness levels. And so let's potentially fix that issue. So I'm going to disable the render view here, and I'm going to go to the dome light, click that. I'll bring it down to the second below the floor here. And I'm going to just bring this down to black, and that will fix the render boxes that you will get if you don't do this. Okay. And that's it. You just render out. So what I'll do is I'll move my playhead to where these disappear. So you can see they fade out at 108. So I'll come in here to my render settings under the output and set this to 108. And there we go. This is ready to save. So my link is going to go up a folder into the 3D renders folder, look at the project name, and then render it out with the project. And so if I do variations, I'll do like V1, V2. So I'll do dash V1 and then render it out, change the seed value. So I'll come in here to the emitter here, the Pyro scene, open this up, go under Pyro and go to the turbulence here and then just change this value to the next seed number. Maybe just increase or decrease the strength of the vortices and render out like maybe 5 or 6 versions of this. And I was getting my render times down to 20 minutes per image sequence. So they were only like 6 seconds a frame. So really quick. Now you're going to want to make sure you actually cache the scene, these advect particles, and you disable all of them once you cached it, except for the advect particle group. Make sure you do that before you render or even try to play it back. Okay, so let's jump into After Effects and take a look at some compositing options. Okay, so here we are inside of After Effects. I'll move to a frame where we can see it. And you can see here that we don't have nice highlights. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate. So Control D or Command D. And on this second layer, we'll come in here, right click in our effect controls, go to color and go to levels. And what we want to do is we want to take this and crunch it till we get just the highlights, something like that. And then what we'll do, and we can adjust this later, we'll just roughly get it in. So it's just the highlights. And then in the blending modes, we'll set it to add. And then here's before and then after. So we're getting these nice highlights right at the densest parts. And that will give us the look. Next, what I'll do is I'm going to go ahead and add an adjustment layer. So in my adjustment layer, I'm going to right click and do color correction, and it's off screen, but it's called tritone. And now we're going to introduce some color. So what we do here is we can go saturate, and I can make this like a blue color. So if I want orange or green or whatever. And what the tritone does is it keeps the highlights white and gives us that energy kind of effect. So I'll set this to 220, and there we go. So there's our first one done. And so I'll let it play out, and there we go. So that is the tritone effect. Gives us that nice curling highlight. And there's our energy field. Now you can see I'm at 50% resolution. So what I would suggest doing is rendering these out at double the size you're going to use it. So I rendered this out at 3,500 pixels square. And I know in the demo I set it to 2,000, but ultimately I want to double the size that I'm using. If I want it 2,000 or 1080, I'll set it to 4K. And then when I'm ready in After Effects, scale it down 50%, and that will give you tighter pixel density. Otherwise, you'll see particles with gaps in them. So here you can see there's a couple gaps, but when you scale it down to 50%, let's turn our render up here. There we go. So when we set it to half, you can see we don't get the visual particles. What you can also do is you can take your base layer and go to blur and sharpen and just add a little bit of a Gaussian blur of depending on how big you make it. I set it to something like 5 or 4, and that will kind of smooth it out as well and get rid of the particle gaps that you might have. Another trick you can do is if it's really bothering you, what you can do is you can just duplicate the base. So Command D, I'll go to position here and I'll just nudge it one up and one to the right and then set this to lighten. And you can see it's smearing those together, and I can take this and duplicate this again and bump it down to the right. So I'm going the opposite direction and set this to lighten, and that will help smear it together. You can see it's blended more. I don't know if it's visible on YouTube, but basically we're just taking it and just bumping it over 1 pixel. And why I came up with this method is because in other particle engines, when you render out particles, you have the ability to duplicate particles as cloned sources next to each other to kind of fill in the gaps. We don't have that option to do that inside of Redshift. I'm just simulating that inside of After Effects as a compositing option. So you can see, there we go. And so now if I want to take my top one and just bring down the highlight, I can do that as well by clamping it. And you can see right here, there's a little boink, little spike in the histogram. You're going to want to take that value and drag it to right on that point, and that'll clamp it properly. And that's it for compositing. Let's go back into Cinema 4D and create some other options like spin and vortices and things like that. So let's go back to Cinema. Okay, here we are back in Cinema 4D. Let's talk about creating some variations in the movement of these particles. So what we can do is we can add an initial spin to this and create kind of a spinning vortex. If you look at the Video Copilot Shockwave effects, a few of them have a twist to them. If we want to create this twisting effect, what we're going to do is we're going to turn on all of these again, go to our particle group here, go to the cache, and I'm going to disable the cache mode here, and that will just turn it off so that now if I play this, it's going to go really, really slow. In fact, I'm going to save my memory and just not do that. And what we want to do is we want to add an initial twist. So to do that, we can go to Simulate Forces, and I can go to this rotation option, and we want to rotate this so the blue arrow is facing towards us, which is -90. And we're going to go in here to the Object tab here, and we'll just crank this up to something like 50, and then go to something like frame 20, and we'll click angle speed and then go 1 frame forward. Let's go a couple frames forward, maybe to 25, drag this down and then click that. And the reason I normally would use enable, but I'm going to be turning this on and off as a kind of a preset. So I'm just going to not do that. I'm just going to animate the amount. And there we go. So what we can do is we can now cache this. So I'll say cache object, and this is going to take a second. So I'll pause the video and come back. Okay, we've cached the scene. Let's give it a play. Oops. You'll probably do this a lot. We're going to turn off all the check marks and then go back to our advection group, leave the dome light on and leave the particle advection group on. We're now in cache mode. So we got some cache money and you can see they have a twist to them. Now this is 10 million particles. So no matter what, it's going to play really slow. This is probably a 40 gigabyte file size. You can see they're swirling and now it's going to turn off and it's going to spin out towards the end. So that's one option you can do. So now they have a twisting effect. You could also twist them in After Effects as well and just spin it. That's another option. The other option is we can push the center particles out more. I'll let this play out and you can see they're twisting. So that's the rotation effect. So that's one option. I've got a render of that. I'll show you guys in a second. If we want to get these particles to push outwards, what we can do is we can come in here to the field force from Star Wars. We'll set this to like 100 and make sure it's on velocity. And we'll come in here to the shape that we want this to push out on. And we're going to go to spherical field. And then we'll drag this out to the size we want, like so. So they come out to about here. So we'll have this center point pushing outward. And what that'll do is I've got a render of that as well. I'll show you where it just pushes them outwards once they hit. So that's it. Now, if it's pushing them out too soon, you can animate this. So start at frame 0, keyframe it, and then go to frame like 25. I'm going to disable this group here so it's quicker. Go to 25 and then go back out to 150. I think I had it set to, let's do 200. There we go. So now this is just scaling outwards and it's going to then push. Let's go to 20. It's then going to animate out and start pushing them, the ones that are straggling in the middle. So that's another option. So we did the rotation and the field force. You don't need to use the turbulence because we have it in the Pyro advection section here. So if we go to the Pyro scene, come in here, go to Pyro, we've got the turbulence right here. So I found adding up turbulence into it is kind of unnecessary. Same with wind. Friction's not necessary because what you can do is you can dampen them if they travel too far, or you can adjust the buoyancy so they don't spread out as far. But that's kind of it. Those are the two main ones I would use, is either rotation and the field force to push them out. I really like having this rotation option. So you can render it out, build it out with the rotation, and then if you don't want it, you just enable and disable it like so. Okay, I'll switch back over to After Effects and show you the twisting effect that I rendered out. Okay, so here's the option with the spin to it. You can see it twists, and I increased the turbulence too, so you can see it really gets crazy and kind of loses its detail. But here's that spin that I was talking about. So you can see there's an initial twist, which is pretty cool. And then I also wanted to show you, I did a render with a flat cube instead of using the collider as a cone. And you can see what happens here. You get a more flat kind of shape, which might be a look that you want, but you get less of a ring effect. But you can clearly see it's pushing against a flat surface. It's a different look, up to you what you go with. That's the other option. You can see we get a better spread. So this is with a cone. And that's it. Okay, guys, I hope you found this useful. Thanks so much. Have fun particle advecting, making shockwaves. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss out on more content. Thanks for your support.